Welcome to another DK Custom Products video. I'm Dwayne and this is Kevin. So Kevin, why are people so preoccupied with horsepower numbers?
I don't know. I'm much more concerned about torque. Today we're going to talk about horsepower and torque in regards to a Harley.
But before we get into that, we'd appreciate if you guys would like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Now Kevin, let's get this ball rolling because this is a touchy subject for a lot of people.
Yeah, and we even succumbed to it when we had our open house. We had a contest to see which Sporty, which Twin Cam, and which M8 had the highest horsepower.
Right.
Why did we do that? That's because that's what everybody's preoccupied with is horsepower. But the fact of the matter is that it's torque that we feel when we're accelerating on our Harleys.
That's exactly right. And you don't really see horsepower until over 5,000 RPMs, 5,200-ish to be exact. And, you know, when we're riding our bikes to Starbucks, we're not seeing those numbers in the RPM range. We're just not. So horsepower takes a back seat to torque for everyday riding.
You ride your bike to Starbucks?
No.
There are thousands upon thousands of articles on the internet. Use Google to get a technical explanation of what horsepower and torque is. And there's videos, articles, you can research till your heart's content. This is not really going to be a technical video, and it's not going to be a video that applies to engines other than the traditional Evo, Twin Cam, M8, that's weird saying M8's traditional, M8 engines that Harley makes. High revving engines are a completely different story.
So what a lot of people will do is they'll put their bike on a dyno and they'll run it and they'll get this printout, and on that printout there's a horsepower number. So
there's also a torque number.
There's also a torque number, but nobody brags. Well, some people brag about the torque number, but the bread and butter that people like to brag about is horsepower. So why is that?
The preoccupation with horsepower comes from outside of the Harley world, comes from the racing world, because above 5,252 RPMs, horsepower is the king. Horsepower is what gets you speed. Below 5,252 RPMs, torque is what you feel. But all the race cars, all the race bikes, they're all running above 5,200 RPM in their normal operating range. And so that's where horsepower is important, and that's where people talk about, oh, this car makes 1,000 horsepower, this car makes 800 horsepower, this bike makes 250 horsepower. But it's all up in the 8, 9, 10, 12, even 16,000 RPM range. And that's not really relevant to a Harley that, from the factory, has a rev limiter at 5,200, and even if you put a tune in it and increase the rev limiter to the max, it's going to be 6,200 RPM unless you have a very specially built, blueprinted Harley engine, and that's not what we're talking about today. And in fact, horsepower is not measured.
That's right.
The only thing that a dyno measures is torque. Torque is twisting force. And the only thing a dyno measures is torque. Horsepower is not measured. Horsepower is a calculation, a mathematical result of a calculation from torque. So a dynamometer, a dyno, is only measuring torque. And then a calculation of torque times RPM divided by 5,252 gives you the amount of horsepower.
Yeah.
It's interesting that Harley, if you go to the Harley website and you look at the performance specs on any of their bikes, like this is a twin-cooled Milwaukee 8 114, displacement 114, compression ratio, etc., etc. Engine torque is 121 foot-pounds at 3,250 RPM. Nowhere on the performance sheet does Harley even publish the horsepower, because the horsepower is irrelevant on the traditional V-twin Harleys. Now, on the Sportster S, which is their higher revving engine that is completely water-cooled, It's in the Pan America and it's in the Sportster S. The torque is 94 foot-pounds, and they do list the horsepower on this, 121 horsepower, but it's 121 horsepower at 7,500 RPM.
Wrapped out, yeah.
Yeah, and then the torque is 94 foot-pounds at 6,000 RPM. And so, because it's a higher revving engine that Harley's making, horsepower is relevant, so they do publish it.
Right. Just to sum it all up, it's basically torque is an instant measurement of how much twisting force is being produced at that moment. So relevant power at that particular time. Horsepower is a measurement of how much of that force is being applied over a set period of time.
Here are a couple examples of some dyno charts showing torque and horsepower. And we'll see in this one of a Sportster, we see the torque line is this top one, and it peaks around 3,600 RPM. And then the horsepower, you see it slowly building, and then they cross right at 5252. And this engine had the rev limiter set at 6,200 RPM, so you can see that even though they cross at 5252, because it's a Harley and it's made for low RPM power, i.e. torque, not horsepower, that the horsepower does not continue going up after they cross. And so the sweet spot you can see on this bike is really between 2,500 and 5,000 RPM when the torque is really up there, because that's what you feel. And you can see it crossing right at 5252. And then here's another chart that shows a Street Glide with the Stage 4 in it. And you can see that the torque is up there. And again, the horsepower is slowly climbing, but it crosses at the 5252 and the horsepower grows a little bit more. But this is not a factory bike.
No, this is Stage 4.
Stage 4. Just to reiterate, to get the details and all the specifics, there are thousands upon thousands of articles. Just do a Google search, horsepower versus torque, or the myth of torque, the myth of horsepower, explaining horsepower and torque, and you can get a lot of information. Just read that information with the thought in mind, what RPM do I ride at? 95% of Harley riders ride between 2,000, 2,500 and 3,500, 4,000 RPM. Sportster riders maybe get up to 5,000 more often. And that is where torque is the king. And horsepower doesn't come into play until after 5252. And do you really ride in that RPM range?
Right.
If not, torque is what is important to you, not horsepower.
And you may be asking yourself, why are we even talking about this? Like, what would it hurt to have higher horsepower numbers? Really nothing, but when we test our parts, we look for torque because that's the most relevant information. And in the coming weeks, we're going to post a lot of videos about what we look for. In fact, the very next video we're going to put out is what we look for when testing our products.
Yeah, and we'll put up a chart right here. This is an extremely built, I think he has $8,000 in this engine. And you can see the torque grows, the horsepower grows. They cross at 5252, and the horsepower keeps going.
Yeah.
So that is possible with the Harley, but probably we're looking at maybe 5% of the Harley riders even care about riding for a sustained period of time over 52 RPM. And so we look at torque.
Now, a prime example of this is you take your bike to the drag strip. If it's an 1/8 mile strip, your Harley's probably going to walk off on the inline 4-cylinder, the
CBR
sport bikes,
yeah.
You know, even the leader bikes. You know, they're built for horsepower. Now, in the 1/4 mile, no chance. You know, that bike's going to catch up and go. So it's different applications for different bikes. Horsepower, again, not as relevant on a V-twin as it is an inline 4-cylinder.
Because it takes time to get up to 5,200, 52 RPM. And until that time, the torque is going to beat the horsepower.
Yeah. Now, as always, if you guys have any relevant information or input on this subject, leave us a comment below. Y'all ride safe out there.